The three-act structure. You run into this in writing courses, especially in screenwriting courses. And some instructors are very dogmatic. There's only one way to write a novel, and it has to adhere to the three-act structure. I think a lot of the genre fiction writers who are successful that we mentioned earlier on Amazon Kindle probably adhere to the three-act structure, and a high percentage of them may work it in their outline. They may adjust their outline to conform with the three-act structure and make sure they're doing it right. I don't really believe in that. I've never consciously thought about a three-act structure when I've written a novel. You tend to get it right, though. You do if you write a pretty good story, what you think works, a story that works, it probably does fit the structure to a degree. But it's good to understand it, and the three-act structure has gone back to ancient times, ancient plays, and it's again used heavily today in movies and TV shows. You could take a lot of movies and TV shows and pretty easily break them down, kind of back engineer them, and realize that they do follow, at least loosely, the three-act structure. But again, don't let this restrict you. My main advice is get off to a good start here. Get off to a good start in your novel. Start with a good situation. We're going to get into that a little bit more in the what if section. Just start with a good situation and then go from there. I think Stephen King does not consciously worry about a three-act structure, and he's written a lot of pretty dynamic books that keep your interest. They have a beginning with an inciting incident. They have a middle, conflict developing, and they resolve everything in what would be the third act. But I don't think he ever puts it in those terms. But anyhow, let's take a look at the basics of three-act structure. The three-act structure. It's not by any means imperative to try to tailor your novel to the three-act structure, but it is the tried and true form, going back really to ancient times, ancient plays of fiction, plays, films, movies in later years, and novels. And so it's good to understand it. Traditionally, you have three acts. The first is the setup. The second is the confrontation. And the third is the resolution. And it's a little clinical to look at it this way, but we'll give some examples and see if you can understand it a little bit better. Another description would be Act 1 is the exposition, the setup, and the inciting incident. The hero is given a goal. The inciting incident is very important in a novel. Something happens that triggers now the propulsion toward trying to solve the main problem of the novel. We'll give examples of those. But the main thing is, in Act 1, which might be a third of the book, might be a quarter of the book, the first, whatever, the hero has a goal now, a mission. And so the reader's on board because the hero's trying to accomplish something or get away from something or somehow solve something. There's some sort of urgency that's been introduced. Act 2 is really the middle of the story. It's typically the longest act and longest portion. But the hero essentially is trying to achieve the goal and then usually fails. He might get close and it looks like everything's going to work. And then there's a point where, everything is, looks completely hopeless. And then comes Act 3, which is kind of the climax and the resolution, where the hero makes a last attempt to achieve the goal and either succeeds at last or fails forever. But something's resolved, even if it's not resolved well. The hero fails or the main character dies in the end. There's resolution. The reader closes the book and it's been resolved. I like the way this was written. I'm not sure I found this. I'm going to read this little more description of the three-act structure. The three-act structure is just one way to think about a story, so writers shouldn't feel limited. And this I agree with. This is just what I tried to say in the beginning. It's one style. But the benefit of using the three-act structure is that it will help ensure that every scene starts and ends with a clear purpose and direction. So it sort of helps direct you if necessary, even if you don't start plotting your novel with it. So if you're a real non-outliner, you just sort of are letting it fly and you haven't laid out a three-act structure, even if that's not the case, if you find yourself stuck as the novel goes on, pacing issues, that type of thing, it's often useful to fit your story into the three-act structure to see what might be. So I think what they're saying is the three-act structure can bail you out sometimes. Another sort of assessment of the structure, the first act, is to establish the main characters, their relationships, and their world. Later in the first act, there's an inciting incident, which is a catalyst. And again, the story will hinge now from that point forward on resolving this. The second act is the character's attempt to resolve his problem. They usually find themselves in ever-worsening situations. And then the third act is either going to save them or sink them. Third act is the resolution, one way or the other, of the main problem and also of any subplots that might have developed. The third act contains a climax. And you think of movies, most movies you can sort of off the top of your head, you can sort of think of the climactic scene where the rising tensions are brought to a head and dealt with. And then there's an after effect that the reader is left with. I mean, in a movie, a typical climactic scene that you can think of would be a big shoot 'em up, big knockdown, drag out battle in the end. Or in the old days, the old westerns, the two guys come out of the saloon and they have the shootout. But it could be simple. It could, you could have an emotional story, a relationship story, but the climax can still be, one memorable final conversation that they have, which sort of resolves everything one way or the other. So I'm going to take a minute here and look at The Wizard of Oz and just read through it a little bit and get the sense of how The Wizard of Oz fits into the three-act structure. Since most people know the story, if you don't worry about it. Dorothy's home life in Kansas, this is Act 1. Dorothy's home life in Kansas forms the bulk of Act 1, the exposition. We see that her family they're hardworking farmers and that she has a dog she cares for called Toto. We learn that Dorothy feels misunderstood, etc., and underappreciated. Now, the inciting incident would be she runs away from home when she feels like her family doesn't take her seriously. She encounters a professor who encourages her to return, but then a twister, which is a tornado, picks her up and she strikes her head. When she wakes up, she's in the land of Oz. She's frightened and confused, and so on and so forth. She wants to go home, but she's told by Glinda the Good Witch that the only way is to follow the yellow brick road and find the wizard, and it goes from there. And so it's established that the Wicked Witch will now try to also stop her on her journey. That's Act 1. An inciting incident and then a continuation laying out this difficult journey now that she's on. Act 2, and again, typically the longest of the three acts, Dorothy starts meeting the familiar people. She meets the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Lion. They travel down the yellow brick road. They encounter obstacles such as apple-throwing trees and sleep-inducing poppies. Dorothy finally reaches the Emerald City, meets the wizard. He turns out to be a big disappointment. He initially refuses to meet with them, and when he eventually does, he declines to help them until they bring him the Wicked Witch's broomstick. So one more obstacle thrown in. They thought that she thinks she's got it resolved, but now there's ever worsening obstacles. That's typical of a second act. Dorothy must decide whether to take the risk of heading to the Wicked Witch's castle or to give up her chance of going home. And she and her companions decide to confront the witch and take the chance. Act 3 now. While on the way to the Wicked Witch's castle, Dorothy's captured. The witch finds out that the ruby slippers can't be taken against Dorothy's will while she's still alive, so she sets an hourglass and threatens that Dorothy will die when the hourglass runs out. Within Act 3, now you have the climax. And the climactic scene would be considered Dorothy throws a bucket of water on the Scarecrow who's on fire, but she ends up accidentally dousing the witch, who melts into a puddle. Now the guards then hand the witch's broom to Dorothy. So that's almost it, but now there's a lingering resolution, sort of an aftermath. As a result, the Scarecrow receives a diploma, the Tin Man receives a heart, and the Lion receives a Medal of Valor. The Good Witch explains that Dorothy has always had the power to go home. She just didn't tell her earlier because she wouldn't have believed it. Dorothy taps her ruby slippers, heads back to Kansas to lovingly greet her family. So there you have it. The Wizard of Oz, essentially dissected into 3 acts. And the next segment will have some examples of more contemporary 3-act structure.